My name is Claire Bennett, and for 31 years, I thought my family loved me. Then, on a Saturday night in a five-star seafood restaurant overlooking the Boston Harbor, I watched my mother push a bill across the table toward me, a bill for $4,112, and say 5 words that changed everything. "You're paying, Claire." Obviously. I want you to remember that number. $4,112. Because by the end of this story, that number is going to mean something very different to my family than it did that night. But before I tell you what happened at that table, I need you to understand exactly who I was dealing with, because this wasn't the first time. It was just the last time. I was the fourth of 5 children in the Bennett family, and if you asked any of my siblings to describe me in one word, they'd probably say reliable. That word sounds like a compliment. It isn't. In my family, reliable meant the one who pays. My father, Richard Bennett, ran a small insurance agency that never quite made the money he pretended it did. My mother, Diane, hadn't worked in 20 years and treated appearances, the right handbag, the right car, the right restaurant, like religious observance. My older siblings, Marcus, Whitney, and Todd, had spent their adult lives perfecting the art of financial helplessness, always one crisis away from needing help, always somehow landing on their feet while someone else picked up the pieces. My younger sister, Paige, was still in that phase where everyone excuses bad decisions because she's young. And me? I was the boring one. The accountant. I'd spent 10 years building a financial consulting practice from a card table in my apartment to a firm with 11 employees and a name people in Boston's business circles actually recognized. I didn't post vacation photos. I didn't buy a new car every 2 years. I saved. I built. And somewhere along the way, my family decided that my discipline wasn't something to respect, it was something to exploit. It started small, the way these things always do. A missed rent payment here. A temporary loan there. Marcus needed help covering a business venture that failed within 6 months. Whitney needed a few $1,000s for a wedding that ended in divorce 18 months later. Todd needed bail money once, a story we don't talk about at Thanksgiving. Every single time, I was the one who got the phone call. Every single time, my mother's voice would carry that particular tone, warm and expectant, the tone that said helping me is what family does, Claire, don't be difficult. And every single time I paid. Because I loved them. Because I believed, foolishly, that eventually the debt would even out, that eventually they would see what I was doing for them and treat me like I mattered too. I was wrong. And the lobster dinner was the night I finally understood how wrong. It was my parents' 40th wedding anniversary. My mother had been planning it for months. She wanted one perfect night, her words, at a restaurant called the Gilded Claw, one of those places where the menu doesn't list prices next to the seafood towers because if you have to ask, you can't afford it. I'd offered, weeks earlier, to contribute $200 toward the celebration. That felt generous and fair. My mother had accepted with a strange little smile I didn't think much of at the time. I should have. The night of the dinner, there were 9 of us at a long table by the window, my parents, my 3 siblings, 2 of their partners, Paige and me. I watched with a slowly sinking stomach as my mother ordered for the table without looking at a single price. Whole Maine lobsters. A raw bar tower stacked 3 tiers high. Bottles of champagne that the waiter presented like religious artifacts. My father ordered a bottle of wine that I later learned cost $650 by itself. I told myself it was fine. It was their anniversary. People go a little overboard on big nights. I even enjoyed myself for a while. The conversation was warm. My father told the story of how he proposed to my mother on a rowboat, and for about 90 minutes, I let myself believe I was just a normal daughter at a normal family dinner. Then the check came. The waiter set the black leather folder down in the center of the table with the practiced neutrality of a man who has learned not to have opinions about other people's spending. Nobody reached for it. I remember the silence stretching just a beat too long before my mother picked it up, glanced at the total and slid it, not toward my father, not toward the table generally, but directly toward me. You're paying, Claire. Obviously. I actually laughed, thinking she was joking. She wasn't. Mom, I gave you $200 for this. That was the deal. Don't be dramatic, she said, still smiling for the benefit of the other diners. You're the one who can afford it. We all know that. I looked around the table. Marcus was suddenly very interested in his phone. Whitney was reapplying lip gloss. Todd wouldn't meet my eyes at all. My father, who I genuinely believed might step in, just sighed and said, Claire, don't make this a thing. It's your mother's anniversary. For $1,112. For a dinner I hadn't ordered and had explicitly, in advance, told them I could only contribute $200 toward. Here's the part that still makes my chest tight when I think about it. I paid it. That night, sitting in that restaurant with everyone watching, I put my card down and paid the entire bill, because the alternative, the scene, the humiliation, the years of guilt I knew would follow if I refused, felt worse in that moment than losing $4,000. But something broke in me at that table. Not loudly. Quietly, the way a support beam cracks long before a building actually falls. I smiled. I finished my champagne. I hugged my mother goodbye and told her happy anniversary. And in the cab home, I opened my laptop and started writing a plan. I am an accountant. Precision is not just my job, it's how I process pain. So instead of crying, instead of calling a friend to vent, I did what I do best. I built a spreadsheet. I called it, privately, the ledger. Over the following 2 weeks, I went back through 10 years of bank statements, Venmo requests, wire transfers, and the group text threads where money had quietly, relentlessly flowed in one direction. I documented every loan that was never repaid. Every emergency that mysteriously resolved itself the moment I sent money. Every birthday and holiday where I was expected to cover the gap between what my family wanted and what my family could actually afford. The final number stopped me cold, $211,000. Over 10 years, I had quietly funneled more than $200,000 into my family, not through any single dramatic gesture, but through 1,000 small, just this once, moments that had never, not a single time, been just once. And the lobster dinner, absurd as it sounds, was the moment the fog finally cleared enough for me to see the whole shape of it. I didn't want revenge in the cartoonish sense. I wasn't going to burn anything down or scream at anyone across a dinner table. What I wanted was something quieter and, honestly, something far more devastating. I wanted my family to feel, for one single night, exactly what it was like to need something from someone who had finally decided to stop giving. So I made a decision. I was going to let them plan one more big night. And this time, I was going to make sure the check landed exactly where it belonged. I didn't have to wait long. 3 weeks after the anniversary dinner, my mother called with her voice syrup sweet, already halfway into her pitch before I'd even said hello. Claire, honey, we're thinking of doing something special for your father's 60th birthday. Nothing too big. Maybe the Gilded Claw again? Everyone loved it last time. Everyone loved it. Everyone except the person who paid for it. That sounds lovely, I said, and I meant it, in the way a chess player means it when they let an opponent take a pawn. Let me help plan it this time. I'll handle the reservation. I could hear the relief in her voice, relief that meant she'd already, without asking, assumed I'd be footing this bill too. Oh, that would be wonderful. You're always so good with details. I was about to be very, very good with details. Over the next 2 weeks, I did 3 things. First, I called the Gilded Claw and made the reservation myself, under my name, my card on file, my direct line as the contact. This mattered enormously for what came later. Second, I quietly reached out to each of my siblings individually, in separate conversations, and told each of them the same thing. I'm covering the reservation and the deposit, but everyone's paying for their own meal this time. I already told Mom and Dad. I made sure each of them believed this was a decision my parents had already agreed to. I wanted them walking into that dinner believing the rules had changed, because the rules had. Third, and this is the part I'm proudest of, I called the restaurant back and spoke with the events manager, a woman named Renata who I'd built a genuine rapport with during the planning calls. I explained, honestly and calmly, that I wanted the final bill itemized and split by individual seat, a service the restaurant actually offers for large parties, but one my family had never once requested, because why would they? When I'd always just silently absorbed the total. I set up separate cards on file for every single person at that table. 9 cards. 9 names. 9 individual checks. My family had no idea any of this had happened. As far as they knew, we were all just showing up to celebrate my father. The night arrived. Same restaurant, same corner table by the window, same 9 chairs. My father wore the navy blazer my mother had bought him for the occasion. My mother had her hair freshly done. Marcus showed up 20 minutes late, already talking about a new business idea he wanted to discuss with me privately at some point tonight, which I now understood was code for money. I sat through that dinner with a calm I hadn't felt around my family in years. I laughed at my father's stories. I toasted his 60th birthday and meant every word of it because whatever was about to happen, it wasn't about him not deserving a celebration. It was about everyone finally being asked to actually contribute to one. They ordered the same way they always did. Lobster. Oysters. Champagne. Nobody glanced at a price. Why would they? As far as they knew, Claire was handling it. Claire always handled it. When the meal wound down, Renata approached the table with a small stack of black leather folders instead of one. 9 of them. She set one in front of each person, smiling politely, and said the words I had been waiting 3 weeks to hear. Here are your individual checks for this evening. Please let me know if you have any questions about the itemization. The table went silent in a way I will remember for the rest of my life. My mother opened her folder first. I watched her face cycle through confusion, then irritation, then something close to panic as she saw a total that included 24 oysters, a lobster tail upgrade, and 2 glasses of the restaurant's most expensive champagne, $640. Itemized precisely to her seat. There must be a mistake, she said, looking directly at me. Claire, I thought you were handling this. I handled the reservation, I said, keeping my voice even and pleasant, the same tone she'd used on me 3 weeks earlier. And the deposit. I told everyone their meals were on them tonight. I made sure to mention that to each of you individually. Marcus's face had gone pale over a bill that included 2 lobsters, one for him, one for a to-go order he'd asked the waiter to box up for his girlfriend, who hadn't even attended. Whitney was doing rapid mental math out loud, visibly recalculating whether she had enough left on her card after a recent shopping trip. Todd just stared at his folder like it might change if he looked at it long enough. My father was the only one who didn't seem shocked. He looked at his own bill, then looked at me, and I saw something shift behind his eyes, recognition, maybe, or the first flicker of understanding what 10 years of reliable Claire had actually cost. Claire, my mother said, and her voice had lost every ounce of sweetness now, gone sharp and cold in the way it used to get when I was a teenager and had disappointed her. This isn't funny. I'm not laughing, I said. And I wasn't. I felt, for the first time in longer than I could remember, completely calm. I gave everyone the same courtesy you gave me 3 weeks ago. You told me I was paying, obviously, for a bill I never agreed to. Tonight, everyone's paying for exactly what they ordered. That's not revenge, Mom. That's math. Here's where I have to be honest with you, because this isn't really a story about a restaurant bill. It never was. $4,000 is a lot of money, but it wasn't the money that broke something in me that night at the anniversary dinner. It was the casualness of it. The complete, unquestioned assumption that my worth to this family had been reduced to a line item, that I existed, functionally, as a wallet with a heartbeat attached. Sitting there at my father's birthday, watching my family stare down bills they actually had to pay themselves for the first time in a decade, I wasn't angry anymore. I was grieving. Because what that dinner revealed wasn't just a pattern of financial exploitation, it was the truth that my family had never really valued me for who I was. They valued what I could provide. And the moment I stopped providing it, I watched, in real time, how quickly the affection drained out of the room. Whitney was the first to actually say it out loud, hissing across the table, "This is so embarrassing, Claire. You couldn't have just paid like normal and talked to us about it privately?" And that sentence right there told me everything I needed to know. Not, "I'm sorry we've taken advantage of you for a decade." Not, "You're right, this isn't fair." Just, "You're embarrassing us by making us face a bill we assumed you'd cover." I paid for my own meal. I tipped Renata generously and privately, separately from the table, because none of this was her fault, and she'd handled the whole situation with more grace than my family had managed in years. And then I stood up, thanked my father for the years, wished him a genuinely happy birthday, and left before dessert. The group text that night was brutal. Whitney called me cold. Marcus called me petty. My mother didn't text at all, after everything they'd done for me. I sat with that voicemail for a long time. And then I did something I'd never done before in 10 years of quietly funding my family's lifestyle. I wrote back. Not an apology. Not a defense. A boundary. I sent one message to the family group chat, and I want to tell you roughly what it said, because I think about it often. I told them I had shown my love for this family for 10 years through more than $200,000 I never asked to be repaid and never mentioned until that night, when I was told, once again, that paying for something I never agreed to was simply obvious. I told them that assumption was over, even if the love wasn't. I told them I would keep showing up for birthdays and holidays with gifts, with time, with genuine presence, but not as a bank account. And I told them that if that change altered how they saw me, it probably said something important about what the relationship had actually been. Nobody responded for 3 days. When my father finally called, it wasn't to argue. It was, to my surprise, to apologize, the only real apology I received from anyone in my family that year. He told me he'd known, on some level, for longer than he wanted to admit, that things had gotten unbalanced. He told me that watching me leave the restaurant that night was the first time he'd actually seen me as an adult who had limits, rather than as the daughter who always found a way to make things work. We talk regularly now, my father and I. Slowly, carefully, the way you rebuild something that was cracked for a very long time. My mother and I are still working through it. Some days that feels hopeful. Some days it feels like we're speaking 2 different languages about the same decade. Whitney and Marcus have mostly kept their distance, which, I won't pretend this doesn't sting sometimes, has also been the most peaceful my life has felt in years. Todd, of everyone, reached out privately to say he understood, and even offered, unprompted, to start paying back a loan from 4 years earlier. I told him I appreciated it more than he knew, and that I wasn't keeping score anymore, not because the money didn't matter, but because I'd finally stopped needing it to prove anything about my worth. Paige, my younger sister, called me the week after everything happened and said something that has stayed with me since. "I always thought you were the strong one because you never needed anything from anyone. I didn't realize it was because you'd never been allowed to." That sentence undid me more than the entire lobster dinner ever had. I think about that black leather folder a lot, the one my mother slid across the table with 5 careless words. Asterisk, "You're paying, Claire." Obviously, asterisk, for 10 years, that was the quiet operating principle of my entire family. Claire will handle it. Claire always handles it. What I learned, sitting at that second dinner watching 9 separate checks land exactly where they belonged, is that love that only flows in one direction isn't really love. It's an arrangement. And arrangements can be renegotiated. I still send birthday gifts. I still show up for holidays. I still love my family, messy and complicated as we are. But I don't pay for a seat at that table anymore. I never will again. If there's one thing I'd want you to take from this story, it's this: being the reliable one doesn't mean you owe everyone else your life savings. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself and, honestly, for the people who've been taking advantage of you is hand them their own bill and let them finally see the real cost of what they've been asking you to carry.